Look, we've all had bad days at the office. You spill some coffee on your shirt, the Wi-Fi goes down, or maybe your boss is being a real pain. But I can guarantee your Tuesday hasn't been accidentally dissolved into an organic soup by your own chairbad. In the closing years of World War II, the German Luftwaffe was getting desperate. Like, trying to build a spaceship in a shed desperate. They needed something fast enough to catch Allied bombers and scary enough to make the Americans rethink the whole invading Europe idea. What they came up with was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. On paper, it was a miracle. It was the fastest thing in the sky, a rocket-powered dart that could outrun the wind itself. But there was a catch. Actually, there were about a dozen catches, and most of them involved exploding, melting, or simply vanishing. The comet didn't just fight the Allies, it fought the laws of physics, the limits of chemistry, and more often than not, its own pilot. This is the story of the acid coffin, a machine that was too advanced for its own good and way too dangerous for the poor souls who had to fly it. Welcome to the front line of German desperation. Chapter 1. The Liquid Executioner. It is a crisp morning at Brandes Airfield in 1944. The ground crew is scrambling toward a Messerschmitt Me 163 that has just skidded to a halt on the runway. There is no smoke, no jagged holes from Allied machine guns, and the canopy is still intact. But something is wrong. A strange, yellowish vapor is hissing from the fuselage, and the cockpit glass looks like it is being steamed from the inside by a tea kettle. When the crew finally wrenches the canopy open, they do not find a pilot. Not exactly. They find a flight suit slumped in the seat, and inside that suit is a bubbling, organic slurry. The pilot has not just died, he has been chemically digested. This was the horrific calling card of the Me 163's primary fuel, a substance known as T-Stoff. To the engineers, it was 80% high-test hydrogen peroxide, a miracle oxidant. To the pilots, it was an invisible executioner. If a single drop touched your skin, it did not just burn. It reacted with your tissues to create a spontaneous, white-hot fire. In the event of a rough landing, and trust me, every landing in a Comet was rough, the fuel tanks would often rupture, flooding the cockpit with this corrosive hell. The pilot would be trapped in a tiny glass box, watching himself turn into liquid before he could even unbuckle his harness. But the fuel was not the only thing trying to kill you. Even if the chemicals stayed in their tanks, the mission profile was a nightmare. You see, the Comet was not a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a point defense interceptor. That is military speak for a weapon that sits on the ground until the enemy is right on top of it. A Comet pilot had exactly 7 minutes of powered flight. That is it. In the time it takes you to soft-boil an egg, these men had to ignite a temperamental rocket engine, blast into the stratosphere at vertical speeds that would make a modern jet pilot sweat, find a formation of B-17 bombers, and make their move. Once those 7 minutes were up, the engine did not just sputter, it went cold. Suddenly, you were sitting in a 30-foot wide lead weight, 5 miles above the earth, with no power and a bunch of very angry Americans in P-51 Mustangs looking for revenge. You were a glider. A very fast, very heavy, and very vulnerable glider. You had to navigate your way back to a tiny strip of grass while dodging escort fighters, praying that the residual fumes in your empty tanks did not decide to spontaneously combust from the friction of the air. The tragic irony of the Me 163 was that it was a masterpiece of physics built by people who had run out of time. Germany was losing the war. Their cities were being turned into rubble, and the Comet was their silver bullet. It was a technological leap that jumped over 20 years of aviation history in a single bound. It was the fastest plane in the sky, a machine so advanced that Allied pilots literally did not believe their own eyes when it zipped past them. But speed is a jealous mistress. To get that velocity, the Germans traded away safety, reliability, and the lives of their best pilots. They built a revolutionary aircraft that spent more time killing its own operators than it did the enemy. It was the ultimate expression of late war desperation. A machine that promised salvation but delivered only a very fast way to reach the grave. Chapter 2. The Tailless Dream. Long before the Me 163 was melting pilots and scaring the daylights out of Allied bomber crews, it was a dream. But it was not a dream of war. It was a dream of perfection. Specifically, the aerodynamic perfection of a man named Alexander Lippisch. Lippisch was not your typical military contractor. He was a guy obsessed with the flying wing. He looked at a standard airplane, with its long fuselage and big tail fins, and saw nothing but drag. To him, a tail was just a rudder you did not need if you were smart enough to design a wing correctly. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, while the rest of the world was busy adding more struts and wires to biplanes, Lippisch was working at the German Gliding Institute. He was building these graceful, silent, tailless birds. His masterpiece was the DFS 194. It looked like something from a 1950s sci-fi movie, smooth, swept back, and incredibly stable. It was designed to be the ultimate glider, a machine that could stay aloft on a whisper of wind. But as the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the guys in the fancy Hugo Boss uniform stopped caring about graceful gliders. They wanted a hammer. In a move that probably made Lippisch's skin crawl, the German Air Ministry forcibly uprooted him and his entire team. They were packed up like a traveling circus and moved to the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg. This was a clash of cultures. You had the idealistic aerodynamicists on one side and the cold, hard military manufacturing machine of Willy Messerschmitt on the other. The project was given the cryptic name Project X. The goal was simple, yet insane. Take Lippisch's beautiful, tailless glider and strap a rocket to its backside. That rocket was the brainchild of Helmuth Walter. Now, Walter was not trying to build a fire-breathing dragon. His engine was a chemical marvel that relied on a process called cold combustion, though cold is a relative term when you are dealing with steam hot enough to melt lead. The engine worked by shoving two chemicals together, T-Stoff and C-Stoff. When they touched, they did not need a spark plug. They just happened. It was a hypergolic reaction. Think of it like a bad blind date where the moment you meet, the restaurant explodes. This engine provided thousands of pounds of thrust instantly, but it was temperamental. If the flow of chemicals was not perfectly balanced, the engine would not just quit, it would disassemble itself with extreme prejudice. This was the unholy alliance that birthed the Comet. You had the most advanced airframe ever designed being pushed by a propulsion system that was essentially a controlled explosion in a tin can. Lippisch hated the interference from Messerschmitt's engineers, who kept trying to add weight and war stuff to his clean design. Meanwhile, the pilots were looking at the blueprints and wondering why there was not a seatbelt strong enough to keep their internal organs from shifting during takeoff. They were marrying the grace of a swan to the kick of a mule, and they were doing it under the crushing pressure of a world war that Germany was starting to lose. The tailless dream was becoming a mechanical nightmare before the first prototype even left the hangar. Chapter 3: Breaking the Barrier. By 1941, the Me 163 was no longer a collection of sketches and what-if equations. It was a physical reality, sitting on the tarmac at Peenemünde, looking like a very angry egg with wings. The man chosen to see what this thing could actually do was Heini Dittmar. Now, being a test pilot in Nazi Germany was already a job description that implied a certain disregard for one's own longevity, but climbing into the Comet was on a whole different level. Dittmar was not just testing a new plane, he was volunteering to be a human cannonball. On October 2nd, the sky was clear, perfect for making history or a very large crater. Dittmar was towed into the air by a Messerschmitt Bf 110. Once he reached the proper altitude, he pulled the release cable, banked away, and reached for the ignition switch. Imagine the silence of a glider suddenly replaced by a roar so loud it felt like the sky was tearing in half. The Walter rocket engine kicked in, and the Comet did not just accelerate, it leaped. Dittmar watched the needle on his airspeed indicator sweep past the marks for 400, 500, and 600 miles per hour. He hit 1,003 kilometers per hour. That is roughly 623 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, while the rest of the world's frontline fighters were struggling to touch 400, Dittmar was pushing the boundaries of what the human body could endure. He was the fastest man on the planet, flying a machine that was basically a pressurized fuel tank with a seat. But as he pushed toward that record, something strange happened. Something that terrified him. The aircraft began to vibrate with a violence that felt like it was being hit by invisible hammers. The nose started to pitch down toward the earth, and the controls, which had been light and responsive, suddenly felt like they were set in concrete. Dittmar had accidentally slammed into a ghost. He had reached the compressibility zone, the very edge of the sound barrier. At those speeds, the air does not just flow over the wings anymore. It piles up like a snowbank, creating shock waves that destroy lift and rewrite the laws of aerodynamics. Science did not even have a solid name for it yet, but Dittmar was living it. He managed to cut the engine and wrestle the Comet back into a stable glide, surviving a phenomenon that would kill dozens of pilots over the next decade. He had proven that the rocket plane was the undisputed king of the sky, but he had also discovered that the faster you go, the more the universe tries to swat you down. You would think a feat like this would be plastered across every newspaper in Germany, but the Third Reich was a place of obsessive, self-defeating secrecy. Because the Me 163 was Project X, the government slapped a top-secret label on the flight and buried it. They could not brag about the world record without telling the British and Americans exactly what kind of interceptor was coming for them. Heini Dittmar went home that night as the fastest man in history, yet officially, nothing had happened. The record remained a ghost. hidden in a filing cabinet while the engineers tried to figure out how to stop their world record plane from shaking itself to pieces every time it tried to do its job. The success of the 1941 tests gave the Luftwaffe leadership a false sense of confidence. They saw the speed and the climb rate and thought they had found the ultimate shortcut to air superiority. They did not see the vibrations, the frozen controls, or the fact that their miracle plane was nearly impossible to fly at the very speeds it was designed to reach. They were so blinded by the numbers on the stopwatch that they ignored the warning signs from the man in the cockpit. The Comet was fast, yes, but it was also a bucking bronco that was only 1 or 2 miles per hour away from a total structural failure. Chapter 4: The Fire Baptism at Brandis. By the summer of 1944, the theory of the rocket fighter collided with the brutal reality of the Allied air war. The Me-163 was no longer a secret project, it was a desperate line of defense. The pilots of Erprobungskommando 16, stationed at Brandis near Leipzig, were the guinea pigs for this lethal experiment. Every mission began with a ritual that was part aviation and part suicide pact. Because Alexander Lippisch had refused to ruin his perfect wing with heavy landing gear, the Comet took off on a 2-wheeled wooden dolly. The moment the plane left the ground, the pilot pulled a lever to drop the wheels. If those wheels did not drop straight, or if they bounced off the runway and hit the fuselage, the impact could spark a fire in the residual fuel tanks. And as we've established, a fire in a Comet was not a situation for the fire department, it was a notify the next of kin situation. If you survived the takeoff, you were treated to a ride that felt like being strapped to the front of a skyscraper falling upward. You climbed to 30,000 feet in under 4 minutes, leaving the frantic escort fighters below in a trail of white steam. But then came the impossible part: actually hitting something. Imagine you are driving a Ferrari at 200 miles per hour and you are trying to throw a dart through a window of a school bus moving at 40. That was the tactical reality. The Comet closed the distance so fast that the German pilots often had less than 3 seconds to sight their 30mm cannons and fire. To make matters worse, those cannons had a slow rate of fire and a low muzzle velocity. By the time the pilot saw the B-17 in his crosshairs and pulled the trigger, he was usually already past it. Most Comet sorties ended with the pilot zooming through a formation of bombers, having fired exactly 0 shots, and then, silence. The rocket engine would cut out as the fuel ran dry. The roaring beast suddenly became a very heavy, very awkward glider. This was the glide of death. The pilot now had to navigate a predictable, unpowered path back to the airfield while every P-51 Mustang in the sector converged on him like sharks smelling blood. The Americans eventually learned that you did not need to dogfight a Comet, you just had to wait for its flameout. They would loiter over the German air bases, watching for the silent, silver darts to begin their long, slow descent. If the pilot managed to dodge the Mustangs, he still had to stick the landing. The Comet landed on a single metal skid under the belly. If the landing was too hard, the pilot's spine took the full force of the impact. If the skid did not deploy correctly, the plane would cartwheel across the grass. And if there was any T-Stoff left in the lines, the smallest jolt could trigger a chemical explosion. It was a cycle of terror that repeated every time a bomber stream appeared on the radar. The Germans were sending their most elite pilots into the sky in a machine that was tactically brilliant for about 90 seconds and a total liability for the other 5 minutes of the flight. The baptism of fire at Brandis proved that the Me-163 was not a fighter, it was a high-stakes gamble that the Luftwaffe was losing every single day. Chapter 5: The Shadow Trigger. When your top-tier interceptor is moving too fast for a human brain to process, you have 2 choices. You can either slow the plane down, or you can take the human out of the equation. Since the Luftwaffe was not about to give up their speed advantage, they went with the sci-fi option. They decided to build a weapon that could think for itself. Enter the SG-500 Jagdfaust. It was a system that sounded like something straight out of a Cold War spy thriller, but it was being bolted into cockpits in early 1945. The Jagdfaust consisted of 10 vertically firing mortar tubes, 5 in each wing root. These were not aimed forward at the enemy, they were aimed straight up at the sky. The brain of the system was a simple optical sensor, essentially a primitive light meter. The idea was elegantly insane. A Comet pilot would dive deep under a formation of B-17 bombers, flying so fast that the American gunners could not even rotate their turrets in time. As the Comet streaked beneath the belly of a massive bomber, the aircraft would pass through the bomber's shadow. That sudden drop in light would trigger the sensor, which would instantly fire the mortars upward into the thin, unarmored belly of the fortress. In theory, the pilot did not even have to look at the enemy. He just had to fly a straight line and let the machine do the killing. It was the world's first automated, sensor-fused weapon system used in air-to-air combat. But like everything else with the Comet, the high-tech solution came with a side serving of "this might kill you too." Firing 10 high-explosive mortars at once created a massive amount of recoil. On one of the few test flights, The force of the guns firing actually caused the aircraft to stall and tumble, nearly sending the pilot into a permanent dive. Only once did the Jagdfaust actually prove its worth in the real world. In April 1945, a pilot named Fritz Kelb spotted a B-17 and decided to trust the machine. He dove under the bomber at nearly 500 miles per hour. He did not pull a trigger. He did not even look through his gun sight. He just flew through the shadow. A split second later, the mortars erupted, tearing the wings off the B-17 and sending it spiraling down. It was a terrifyingly efficient kill, a glimpse into a future of fire-and-forget missiles and computerized warfare. But it was a single kill in a war where the Allies were flying thousands of bombers a day. While the engineers were playing with light sensors, the pilots were still dealing with the chemical horror of their flight suits. Because the T-Stoff fuel was so hungry for organic matter, a standard leather flight jacket was basically a piece of kindling waiting to happen. The Luftwaffe had to issue PC fiber suits, which were essentially made of plastic. They were stiff, they did not breathe, and they made the pilots sweat like they were in a sauna. So, you had a pilot, soaked in sweat, wrapped in a plastic bag, flying a rocket that fired itself based on shadows, while the entire Third Reich was collapsing around his ears. It was a bizarre, surreal end to a project that had started with a dream of a tailless glider. The Jagdfaust was a masterpiece of desperate ingenuity, but it was like trying to stop a forest fire with a very high-tech squirt gun. Chapter 6. The Comet's Ghost. When the Allied tanks finally rolled onto the airfields at Brandis and Husum in 1945, they did not just find a defeated enemy, they found a graveyard of the future. Dozens of Me-163s sat abandoned in hangars, looking like toys left behind by a giant. To the average infantryman, they were just weird, tailless curiosities. But to the intelligence teams of Operation Lusty, they were the ultimate prize. The Americans, British, and Soviets fell over each other to crate these machines up and ship them home. They knew that while the Comet had not saved Germany, the data hidden inside its wings was worth more than its weight in gold. The British were particularly interested. They handed one of the captured acid coffins to Captain Eric Winkle Brown, arguably the greatest test pilot to ever live. Brown was a man who had flown everything from biplanes to the world's first jets, but even he found the Comet unsettling. He flew it under power after the war, a feat that required a level of bravery that borders on a death wish, and his report was chilling. He called it a suicide machine. He noted that while the speed was intoxicating, the handling at high Mach numbers was like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. One wrong move, one slight overcorrection, and the plane would simply fly itself into the ground. But the real legacy of the Me-163 was not in its combat record, which was pathetic. Honestly, it was in its DNA. Alexander Lippisch's tailless wing design was the direct ancestor of the supersonic age. You can see the ghost of the Comet in the British DH.108 Swallow, which eventually claimed the life of Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. while trying to break the sound barrier. You can see it in the American Northrop X-4 Bantam and the legendary X-15 rocket plane. The engineers who built the Me-163 had mapped out the forbidden territory of high-speed flight, and the Allies used those maps to reach for the stars. There is a dark, uncomfortable truth at the heart of the space race. The rockets that took us to the moon were built on the lessons learned from machines designed to kill. Every time a space shuttle sat on the launch pad, venting white steam from its liquid oxygen tanks, it was echoing the hiss of a comet on a runway in 1944. The Me-163 proved that you could put a human being on top of a controlled explosion and send them to the edge of the atmosphere. It was the first time we harnessed the power of the rocket for manned flight, and we did it in the most brutal, dangerous way imaginable. Today, the surviving comets sit quietly in museums. They look small and harmless, their wooden wings painted in the mottled greens of a lost empire. But if you look closely at the cockpit glass, you can still imagine the terror of a 19-year-old pilot, wrapped in a plastic suit, watching the shadow of a B-17 sweep across his wing. The Me-163 remains a haunting reminder of what happens when scientific genius is fed into the furnace of total war. It was a failure as a weapon, a disaster as a vehicle, but as a bridge to the future, it was a triumph that changed the world forever. So, what do we make of the Me-163 Comet? On one hand, it's a triumph of human ingenuity. A group of guys in a crumbling country managed to build a literal spaceship while the world was falling apart around them. On the other hand, it's a masterclass in the just because you can does not mean you should school of engineering. It was a plane that required its pilots to wear plastic bags so they would not melt, and it used a landing system that was basically a glorified belly flop. The Comet was a weapon of impossible odds. It was too fast to aim, too dangerous to fuel, and too vulnerable to land. It's the ultimate example of gold-plating a problem. The Germans did not need a rocket-powered spaceship. They needed about 5,000 more regular fighters and the fuel to fly them. Instead, They spent a fortune in marks and lives on a machine that achieved a grand total of maybe 16 aerial victories. To put that in perspective, more people probably slipped and fell in the Brandis Air Base shower than were shot down by the Jagdfaust. In the end, the Komet is a reminder that war has a way of turning geniuses into mad scientists. Alexander Lippisch wanted to touch the sky with a perfect wing. The Luftwaffe just wanted a way to dissolve their enemies, and ended up dissolving their own instead. It's a tragic, ironic, and incredibly fast footnote in history. A machine that was designed to save the Reich, but instead, it just gave the rest of us a very expensive, very dangerous head start on the way to the moon. Next time you're feeling frustrated by a little glitch in your tech, just be glad your laptop is not filled with T-Stoff, because as the pilots of the Me-163 learned the hard way, being on the cutting edge of technology usually means you are the one getting cut.